Welcome to the Hyperledger Tampa Meetup. We are BlockSpaces, a blockchain product development company in Tampa, Florida, working on predominantly enterprise solutions for blockchain, and Hyperledger, of course, being one of the most mature, if not the most mature enterprise blockchain solution. We have been the Hyperledger Tampa Meetup since 2018. And there's so much going on in the space now that we just really felt like we could do an update and kind of let the community know what's happening with Hyperledger, how they can possibly get involved, and just kind of keep current to some of the things that are happening in the space. So I'm going to be kind of co-presenting a little kind of Q1 Hyperledger update along with Gabe. We will go ahead and get started. We had quite a few people RSVP to this. So if you're either joining us live or if you're joining us later, then we welcome you. Obviously, let us know if you want to get involved. Just check us out. And either at BlockSpaces, or of course you can go straight to Hyperledger too. But if you're interested in Hyperledger, whether it's development, deployment, or integration, we would love to talk to you. So make sure to check us out at blockspaces.io too. Yeah. So kind of a little bit of what's been happening in Hyperledger. There's been quite a bit of projects momentum. You can go to the next slide, Gabe.
And just a quick note that this is the Q1 update. They are working on the Q2 update, which hasn't been released yet. So there's going to be a lot of updates to keep track on what's going on with the Hyperledger suite.
Yep, and we'll go into that in a little bit. A lot of people kind of associate Hyperledger just with IBM, and that's really a little bit of a misconception, even though Hyperledger Fabric and IBM are closely related. It's not just IBM that does Hyperledger. It's really almost impossible to believe that it's only been 4 years since the launch of Hyperledger, which to us in some ways kind of marks the beginning of enterprise blockchain. So if you let that sink in for a minute, all of this talk about enterprise blockchain, it's only been 4 years since that project launched, and that's a project out of the Linux Foundation called Hyperledger. It's just unbelievable to me how fast this space moves. 14 projects encompass the Hyperledger kind of suite of projects. There's been 3 1.0 production releases, 1 2.0 production release that we'll talk about in a little bit, 14 active communities, working groups, and some of those working groups are working on some very specifically industry use cases. They're working on tools. It's an extremely active community, 170 plus meetups worldwide. We are Hyperledger Tampa, and 67,000 meetup participants, 250 members of the Hyperledger project, including people like IBM, Deloitte, Accenture. 50 of those companies are in China. So as you can see, there is a lot of momentum nationally, internationally, and with a very vibrant and large community that we're really always been very proud to be a part of. I'm very happy to bring it to Tampa. Think about Hyperledger, like I talked about before, as a modular approach to hosting projects. We think of Hyperledger as a greenhouse that grows and sustains blockchain projects from seed to fruition. That project, again, was started by the Linux Foundation. IBM was one of the very early companies that came on and started contributing code to their first project called Hyperledger Fabric, which is the most mature enterprise blockchain. And they really provide infrastructure for open development, all through this extremely diverse and thriving community that, like we said, we really encourage you to become a part of. And we're very active in that community. So we would love to have you join us. Okay, I'm going to go over the suite here, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, Gabe. So this is a snapshot of the Hyperledger Greenhouse. And like I said, you can see Fabric kind of right there in the middle. And that's kind of what everybody thinks of when people say, if you hear someone saying IBM Hyperledger, you know that they're talking about Fabric, but there's so many other projects and, like you said, libraries and tools, domain-specific projects And then there's a lab that's specifically kind of to allow these projects to kind of incubate. Gib's going to kind of run you through these distributed ledger projects and how some of these tools and libraries work a little bit later on in the presentation. But just to give you kind of like this overview of that, when someone says Hyperledger, they're talking, pen them down because they could be talking about any of these particular things. But most of the time they're probably talking about Fabric. So, all right, Gabe, you want to kind of take it?
Sure. So, as you can see, some of the major releases that have happened in the last quarter now, Q1. A big one is the Hyperledger Fabric 2.0 release that went live in January. And this new version allows users to try out the new support for the decentralized governance and smart contracts and more. Of course, you can go on to hyperledger.org to read more about what's happening with Fabric and everything that's happening in Hyperledger period. But this is kind of like a quick overview. Hyperledger Besu has released its 1.4 version, which is now putting the project into an active status, which means it's coming out of kind of like the testing phase and more into a more mature phase where you can use some of their newer features like tracing APIs, multi-tenancy, advanced key management, and more. So if you're looking to develop these things, and we'll go over exactly what Fabric does and what Besu is for. These each have their own applications and use cases of why they're projects in the Hyperledger suite. So to go over some of the new projects that have been released, and there's more coming on all the time. So Hyperledger Avalon is a ledger-independent implementation of the trusted compute specifications published by the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, and this aims to enable a secure movement of blockchain processing off of the main chain to a dedicated computing resource. So obviously you don't not all information and all data that's transacted you want on a blockchain. That's not efficient. You are going to have, in a lot of cases, off-chain data that's kind of linked or hashed to the data that is put on a main chain. So Avalon is designed to help developers gain the benefits of computational trust and mitigate its drawbacks. Such as trying to put everything on a blockchain, especially when it doesn't make sense to. Then you can, if you can screenshot this link if you want to try to go to that later on. We can post this in our channels as well. So the newest SIG, which is the special interest groups that they have, Hyperledger, is the Climate Action and Accounting Group, which is an SIG that focuses on bringing stakeholders together to look at climate-related use cases, such as using Hyperledger frameworks to build a global and open climate accounting system to support goals of the Paris Agreement. Also, the Education Architecture, which is a group that will investigate the integration of data across multiple institutional and informal and workplace learning experiences in a student's lifetime of learning, and whether these can be integrated into a comprehensive record of one's knowledge, skills, and ability. So these are, again, SIGs that you can join and be a part of and contribute, or just sit there and learn what's happening. But a lot of people are taking interest into these different groups within the Hyperledger suite of applications and tools. This is just more things to be a part of. Kind of building the infrastructure, the technical infrastructure that these projects are going to to use.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, those are just the two newest ones. Like I said before, there's 14 different active communities and SIGs within Hyperledger. So, like I said, either go to Hyperledger or contact us directly, and we can kind of get you linked into, whatever your area of interest is, whether you're a developer or an enterprise that's interested in these different applications. We can certainly help you get plugged in to some of the things that are going on there that are very specific around specific use cases.
Exactly. So some events, again, this is from Q1, so this isn't totally relevant. But they did have the Hyperledger 2020 Global Forum earlier this year, which went really well. Of course, this was before COVID hit. But they had over 450 global attendees working in over 20 different industries, 90 plus sessions, including demos and technical how-tos and workshops. Industry analysis and media was in attendance, 400 plus articles, 1,300 plus tweets using Hyperledger Forum hashtag, and garnering over 17 million Twitter impressions. So it was a really good event. We were almost there, but I think we got wind of COVID, kind of
that's exactly
taking root, and we made the conscious decision not to travel during that time. And I think it was a good time because I think this happened just as it was hitting, right before they started shutting down all the airports and stopping plane flights and stuff. So.
Yep.
I think we made a good call, but we would have loved to have been there, and we plan on being there in the future. But you can catch all the sessions that were had on the Hyperledger YouTube channel. So definitely check those out. A lot of great content. A lot of people are sleeping on all the stuff that's happening with Hyperledger, and it's very interesting, to say the least.
Yes,
and of course,
and what interesting, I think one really interesting thing is that two of the newest members of the Hyperledger community are Cardano and Rootstock, which of course is built on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. So they have just recently joined the Hyperledger community. So there's lots of collaboration, and I think really big things coming from that community. Even bigger than what already are, which is quite a lot.
Definitely. So you can see they hold global meetups are happening all around the world. We're connected to this larger global network of Hyperledger meetups that are happening. In the future, we are going to pull from the resources of special guest speakers that they have on tap to contribute to these meetups. So and they have a very impressive list of people. So we're going to start organizing that a little bit more and being a little bit more formalized about this meetup going forward. So this is just kind of getting our feet wet again with doing Hyperledger meetups. So, Rose, do you want to go over some of these use cases that we're seeing Hyperledger being used for?
Sure. So again, that, as we were talking about the special interests earlier, we're seeing like such a full spectrum of industry use cases. And those really vary. It's not, I think a lot of people think of Hyperledger as being, just private and permissioned, distributed ledger technology, but it is really changing. And while that may have been the case at the beginning, there is this embracement of decentralization, this understanding of that governance and networks are very important, critical to blockchain. So there's this constant evolution of projects. And so if you think that you understood Hyperledger 4 years ago, I highly encourage you to research it again or get back involved, because there is this very rapid transition into the whole spectrum of decentralization, a very large understanding of governance models and what needs to work there. Like I said, with Cardano and Rootstock being part of that community, you can only imagine that that kind of innovation and that spectrum of use cases is going to continue to be really large. Okay.
Definitely, yeah. Cardano, incidentally, is having their Cardano Summit right now, starting today and into tomorrow, where they're making a bunch of pretty big announcements.
Yeah, really exciting. So of the Forbes blockchain 50, 52% of the blockchain 50 use Hyperledger, some kind of Hyperledger. Of course, we're seeing the majority of that being in Hyperledger Fabric. That's just part and parcel to it being the most mature. It's the most mature. It's the only one that's at 2.0, and it was the first one launched. So it's just got a lot more. It's got a lot more history. So 4 years, a lot more history, right? That's kind of crazy, but it's true. So 52% are using Hyperledger. And as you can see, there's 22 that are using Ethereum, 11 Corda and 7 Quorum. So that's the top 50 blockchain projects. And so that kind of really kind of sums it up. Indy, of course, Sawtooth primarily is kind of Intel's play for supply chain. Indy, of course, being digital ID, and BlockSpaces has developed a digital ID project on Indy, so we are familiar with that one very, very much so. And some of these projects again are up and coming. They're in different levels of their different statuses as far as what whether they're in beta or they're in full production. Some really, like I said, interesting things going on there, but as you can see, just still so unbelievably new. And then again, here we have half of the Forbes blockchain 50 is built on Hyperledger. Here's some of the companies that are actually using Hyperledger right now. So obviously every single name on here, we all recognize. These are huge names and with very big projects. I think the only thing that, that hasn't been mentioned here, and this might have been launched in Q2, which I think it was Cactus launched in Q2. So Hyperledger Cactus is the newest addition to Hyperledger. We're just familiar with it because it's focused on interoperability and integration, and that's a big, big thing for BlockSpaces going forward. So we are very interested and very much on top of the Hyperledger Cactus project. That is the newest of the new, very much in its infancy, but super exciting project. So we are very highly keeping an eyeball on that because multi-blockchain integration is really of interest to us, and of course with a core platform that we're developing around that. So keep an eye on these projects and keep an eye on some of the things that are coming down the pike for blockchain integration. You want to take this one, Gib, Honeywell?
Yeah, so this is a use case that we found really interesting that came out, I think, later last year. But Honeywell, which is a fairly large corporation that works in the aerospace industry, among other things, but they have done something really innovative. Of course, using Hyperledger Fabric, I believe, is what they saw is in dealing used airplane parts. There's a massive discrepancy in how the information trail of where those parts came from, the condition they were found in, where they were manufactured originally, and the specs for each piece. It was really hard to kind of decipher. So what Honeywell sought out to do was build an entire platform using blockchain primitives in developing a marketplace to be able to easily collect the information and data on each used part, certify its origination, where it came from, and the specs behind that, and then enable transactions on this marketplace that they've developed, where you can easily buy and sell and trade used airplane parts, which is a massive industry. I had no idea, but it is a huge industry, but it's very antiquated in how they actually process the parts themselves and the transactions for buying and selling these parts. As you can imagine, getting these airplane parts it's a very important thing to get right. You can't really get it wrong because you're dealing with aerospace engineering, and so you have to have the exact right parts at very specific specs, or else you're going to put the wrong piece in, and that will not be good. So Lisa Butters is the general manager at Go Direct Trade, which is this spin-off from Honeywell, this marketplace that we're talking about. And they said in the $4 billion industry that used aerospace parts, less than 2.5% of all transactions are done online. So it's still a very antiquated marketplace, haven't stepped up into the digital world yet. And so Honeywell has taken the leap to leverage blockchain technology to enable these kinds of transactions online. So this is very exciting, and we're seeing this similar kind of use case with different enterprises as well. The latest in production deployments are from American Express and Walmart as well. So you can definitely get a sense of how far blockchain has come in a very short amount of time. Like Rosa mentioned earlier, Hyperledger only launched 4 years ago, and that was kind of like the initiation of this concept of enterprise blockchain, which of course at first was kind of a joke. To be honest, a lot of people kind of wrote off the concept, of permission chains and using blockchains. There is like an ideological mind shift that you have to take if you're originally initiated in fully decentralized blockchains. However, the maturity level of these enterprise blockchains has come along quite a bit as well in the past 4 years. So we're seeing how the merging of some of these concepts and ideas is totally viable, and there are real world use cases and applications where some of these lesser decentralized blockchains are still able to be utilized in enterprise for enterprise uses and applications. So that's what that's what we've seen, and that's what we're kind of excited about, because you're not pigeonholed into the one use case of Bitcoin, for instance, where it's just a medium exchange or store of value. It can be, you can leverage these networks for different use cases.
Yeah. And one thing that I think is really interesting about this is that, we talk about one of the things that has been talked about so much with enterprises, where is the ROI of blockchain? And so what we're seeing here with what Honeywell is doing and what other companies are actually starting to realize is that blockchain not only allows you to have a system that potentially improves efficiencies within your supply chain or your track and trace capabilities, but it also then opens the door for new revenue, new business models, and new revenues for your company. So in the case of Honeywell, we're seeing blockchain in action for the track and trace features and the efficiencies of their supply chain, as well as this whole new marketplace for used airplane parts. So it's kind of like that double whammy in business. I've improved efficiencies, I've opened a new market. So this is a really perfect example of that. Oh, I'll let you do this one, Gabe. This one's up your alley.
Yeah, some of the other use cases that we're seeing come to the fore, especially in light of COVID, as well, is centered around identity. digital identities and how do you protect them. Of course, there are several different blockchain projects that are in the works right now that are deploying digital identities and verified credentials to those digital identities. Distributed identities, they're not just digital, they're on a distributed ledger. So this enables the user to keep and hold and secure their own personal information or identifying credentials themselves, and those are converted into basically a public key that you can actually share and verify the information that's contained in those verified credentials that are on the blockchain. So CU Ledger is one of these projects that are have developed some services, namely for credit unions to organize offerings, and it's a consumer-focused global identity, digital identity solution. And what we're seeing is, which is really exciting. Of course, they're using Hyperledger Indy, which is it's a purpose-built blockchain specifically for issuing and verifying and managing distributed identifiers. So, we're now seeing this same concept being deployed on several different blockchains, on Ethereum, on Bitcoin, and other purpose-built blockchains where there's also standards being built as well. And the goal ultimately is to make all of these identifiers interchangeable as far as the schematics that are used, so you can create a distributed identifier that is actually deployable and interoperable with multiple identifiers on different blockchains as well. And the end user shouldn't, if we do it right, the end user shouldn't care or know the difference on which blockchain they're actually traversing at any given point. It's just all integrated, interoperable. So this is what's really exciting, because we actually can create a highly secure global identity system that gives the end user more control and more power over their personal identifying information.
Yeah, and I think that that's the biggest key with, there's so much in the media about digital ID, some of these things that are happening with Apple and Google, and the tracing of the credentials for the immunity and all of this, and being very clear that when we're talking about Hyperledger Indy and self-sovereign ID, distributed ID, yes, it's a digital ID solution, but it is not what you're hearing with these digital ID components that are kind of bubbling up, that have people so nervous about this ability to kind of track your identity. And it's definitely a shift in thinking, but it's that same notion that cryptocurrency, of course, allows you to be your own bank. You are the holder of your ID, and that's a big shift in people's thinking. But when you finally get it in your head, I mean, it's almost like having a wallet full of credit cards. You own those credit cards. You take them out and present them, the different ones, as you need to, but then they go right back in your wallet, and you hold that. And that this is the whole concept that we're doing around identity and credentials, and having those credentials actually the user actually holds them, rather than them being stored somewhere else. So it becomes a very secure way to have control over your own data. Again, there's a learning curve there because people aren't used to really getting their head around that, but we're really excited to where this is headed with digital ID.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The difference between these distributed identifiers and normal digital identities, such that you have with Google or Facebook, that you're used to by now logging in to other platforms with, this takes those third-party authenticators out of the out of the picture. So these distributed identities do not have that kind of entity like a Google or Facebook actually spying on all of your transactions that you do online. This is completely self-sovereign to you. Only you have access to and can give the authority to authenticate into an application or some identifying information.
Yeah, and Gabe, it looks like we have a chat that's talking about a project that you're very much involved with, and they're talking about Sovereign and Evernum. And I know that you can talk about CCI a little bit and some of the stuff that we are definitely involved in that. Gabe is in those working groups. So you want to give like a little high level, that's a little bit off of the Hyperledger track, but you want to give a little bit of visibility into what you're seeing in that space?
Yeah, of course. So along this same idea, this is all about self-sovereign identities on distributed ledgers, and the whole idea of trust over IP, which is what Mark is bringing up here in the chat. This concept is actually an old concept, but we really haven't had a really good mechanism to deploy trust over IP, which is basically an authenticating system for identities online. We haven't had a really good way to implement that until blockchain came along. And so now that we have these purpose-built blockchains for distributed identities, we can actually make trust over IP happen. And so there's a big effort to get this underway. And with Hyperledger Indy, the main contributors to Hyperledger Indy in the source code there is the Sovereign Foundation, which is a group of developers that came together and started implementing this this kind of distributed identity solution, and they have given it over to the Hyperledger suite of protocols and tools. The tool set that they're working with is Aries, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So these are some of the things that are underway with kind of completing how we can manage and implement a trust over IP network using these digital identifiers. So this is very exciting work that's happening.
Yeah, I think Hyperledger Indy was actually originally Evernum. Evernum actually contributed the majority of the code. Is that not correct? And then turned it over to Sovereign, who then turned it over to Hyperledger.
Yeah, they're all you know, they're all among the same group of innovators that are really pushing forward this this notion of trust over IP and distributed ledgers that are issuing distributed identifiers and verified credentials. So they've been a big player in the space so far.
Yep, and there's this self-sovereign incubator run by the Sovereign Foundation, and I believe IBM, which we have contact with them. We actually had a call with them just a few weeks ago. So if you're interested in self-sovereign ID, we had like we mentioned, I mentioned earlier, we actually did do a blockchain-based digital ID project for Seminole County last year, and we wrote on Hyperledger Indy. So we would love to talk to you more about that. And if you're interested in this space, we would love to bring you into the fold and let you know, get you involved in everything that's going on here in Tampa with self-sovereign ID, which is quite a bit.
Definitely. So some other use cases. Of course, this is another along the same lines of safeguarding and protecting user data in hyperconnected worlds. So Secure Key launched their Verified.me network based out of Canada, which is a privacy enhancing service that enables consumers to conveniently and privately assert identity information using trusted providers. So this once again leveraging a blockchain to give the credentials of access to that private information back into users' hands. So I think this is something that we'll see more and more of. I think it's really needed with all the hacking that's constantly going on, and that's never going to end or stop or slow down. So we need better tools to be able to encrypt and secure our information, even things as simple as our name and passwords, right? ScanTrust is another implementation where they're tracking food provenance, and the history is stored all on a blockchain. So increasingly, consumers expect clean pork and to know where the ingredients are sourced from. Additionally, companies want to create better loyalty programs as well. So ScanTrust partnered with Unilever to build a solution that provides reports, analysis, and recommendations based on big data from consumers, thanks to connecting the data sources on a blockchain. So additionally, now clients can benefit from better loyalty programs, because you can then, if the food is all tracked from its source, and you can see that track on a distributed ledger, the end user can then see the life cycle of the products that they're actually purchasing, which of course empowering the end consumer with that kind of relevant information just gives them more confidence that they're buying a product that is trustworthy, it's been sourced properly, and meets their own personal guidelines if they're if they care to explore that more. So more information, more data, and this project is leveraging Hyperledger Sawtooth, which these are all different kind of purpose-built blockchains. Fabric is more of, I guess, the generalized one, but Sawtooth is similar, except they leverage IoT devices from Intel chips specifically. So you can see where different applications and use cases require a very specified set of tools and distributed ledger systems that can leverage those tools. So here's another one that's a securities lending project from Israel. So BTP is from a Tel Aviv stock exchange, saw that this market opportunity and had a chance to innovate. And with the help of Accenture and Intel and the Floor, they created a blockchain securities lending platform built again on Hyperledger Sawtooth. Their platform enables peer-to-peer lending and supports a wide range of contracts, creating a liquid market for all securities lending activities. BTP Sextant has been chosen to deploy and manage this platform in production using BTP's freely available enterprise-grade distribution of Hyperledger Sawtooth. So you can see, and this is really one of the things that excites us, I think, about these blockchain applications on an enterprise level, is that it requires cooperation, even amongst different participants that may otherwise be, market competitors. Blockchains really enable more organizations and more institutions to work together and form these networks to be able to participate in a more broader scale. And to me, that's really kind of motivating and encouraging that we can kind of flip the typical, cutthroat capitalist model that we're all kind of used to now, unfortunately, and create better models that are based on cooperation, and still driving all the value without less of the vampirism, if you will. So this is really exciting to see these kinds of advanced security lending platforms. This is something that's really big in the crypto space right now, is these lending platforms where you can leverage your digital assets and borrow against them, which is a financial tool that is now being developed in a decentralized way. So this is very interesting. So now we can get into kind of like the meat and potatoes of these different Hyperledger frameworks, right? And so, you know, you see the greenhouse, you see all the different projects. We've gone over some of the use cases specifically that are being done, leveraging those different platforms. So distributed ledgers are just frameworks that are the basis for the products and solutions that we just went over. They differ in programming and smart contract languages and consensus mechanisms and the governance models. So there are differences. No blockchains are created equal. There's no value in doing that. So each one has to have a differentiator if they're going to have a place in the market. And so this is what we're seeing with the Hyperledger suite, and of course all of the thousands of other blockchains that are out there. So Hyperledger Fabric, of course, the status is active. It's I think the longest running Hyperledger project to date. So this CII badge has best practices, passing. And the description is a distributed ledger in Golang. Golang is the programming language. So the platform for developing blockchain networks with a modular architecture for consensus and membership services. It just upgraded to Fabric 2.0, as we mentioned earlier, and there's hundreds of devs across the world and across hundreds of different companies that are deploying projects using Hyperledger Fabric. Again, it's one of the longest standing Hyperledger projects and platforms, has the most tooling, I believe, and the modular architecture is really what has enabled Fabric to really take hold, because you can select your particular consensus mechanism that you want. There's a couple different ones you can choose from, and it's just really has a general use case application for how you structure that network. So that modular architecture has made it very adaptable for different use cases and applications. So hence it's being used quite a bit.
Yeah, it's still amazing to me to see that, 200 plus devs across the 100 plus companies with hundreds of pilots and production networks deployed, that, for something that literally didn't exist 5 years ago is kind of amazing to me. And so it's so, you feel like you're in kind of a whirlwind sometimes with blockchain, and with as much as happening in the crypto space, which we stay very on top of that as well. And that is a whole other beast that's kind of whirling around us. But we're starting to see these two worlds merge, which is kind of amazing. And so we're starting to feel that very intense interest within enterprise that can only be kind of compared to like that crazy 2017 madness with crypto. But now crypto has a whole life of its own between central bank digital currencies and some of the things that we're seeing coming down the pike with, Rootstock even, deploying smart contracts on the Bitcoin blockchain. So we're starting to kind of see this merge of these two worlds, which of course is, to us, just really unbelievable in such a short amount of time.
Yeah. So yeah, as you can see, the implementations are being deployed in all kinds of different environments, cloud environments, and network systems. So this is a very diverse tool set, and the implementations are everywhere. So Hyperledger Sawtooth, which is also another active project. It's another platform that's a modular platform that's building, deploying, and running distributed ledgers. Sawtooth includes a novel consensus algorithm, proof of elapsed time, which targets large distributed validator populations with minimal resource consumption. Like I said, they specifically are using those resources off of Intel chips. At least they were originally. So Hyperledger's second project released its 1.0 in January of 2018. So Fabric was first, and this is the second project, and this is only 2 years old. So again, you can see how with as nascent as these platforms are, they've taken hold quite a bit and are now managing fairly large networks and applications. So we've seen the growth come a long way in a very, very short amount of time. But now Sawtooth actually supports Solidity in Ethereum's EVM, the Ethereum virtual machine, smart contracts by linking this network with Hyperledger Boro, which is another project that is enabling these kinds of interplays between these different distributed ledger systems. So again, building these infrastructures is definitely going to take some time, and but it's come a long way in such a short amount of time. It's hard to even keep up, honestly. So, and of course, Hyperledger Indy, which we talked extensively about. This has tools and libraries and reusable components for providing digital identities rooted on blockchains or other distributed ledger systems. So they are interoperable across administrative domains, applications, and other silos. It utilizes zero-knowledge proofs to be able to provide verifiable claims, which can be used to prove something about the identity without providing access to the actual underlying information or data. So you can, with zero knowledge proofs, it's precisely what that means is that you're not relinquishing any direct knowledge of the information and data, but you're able to prove and verify that that information is true or hasn't changed. So this is a very powerful cryptographic tool that is being deployed across several different use cases in blockchain protocols across the entire industry because it leverages that cryptographic trick of zero knowledge proofs to be able to secure and make these interactions private. So as we can see, some of the videos that they suggest that you can look at, take a look at that. Again, you can visit the hyperledger.org website or the Hyperledger YouTube channel for some of those resources. And Hyperledger Boro. So this is what was mentioned a couple slides ago, and this is it's still in its nascent incubation period, but they're moving along as far as getting to a point where it's active and deployed in a more broader way. But Boro provides a modular blockchain client with a permission smart contract interpreter built in part to the specifications of Ethereum's virtual machine. It's an Apache licensed EVM. It uses Tendermint as its default consensus mechanism, but it also has been ported to Fabric and Sawtooth. So we're seeing where even the different Hyperledger protocols and projects are being able to interlink with each other in different ways, which provides more use cases and more applications that you can use these tools for. Hyperledger Aurora, which is active in passing its CII best practices. This is a C++ distributed ledger, and it's a business blockchain framework designed to be simple and easy to incorporate into infrastructure projects requiring DLTs. It's written in, we said, C++, and it's incorporating a unique Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus mechanism. So the mobile SDKs and multi-sig support for transactions. Multi-sig is where you have different participants that have to interact with a particular transaction, and you usually have some kind of threshold, like you need 3 of 5 people to confirm that a transaction should happen or go through or be approved in that way for the transaction to actually be signaled to the network. And without those multi-sigs, you can't, that transaction can't go through. So not 1 or 2 participants would be enough to make that transaction happen. So that provides a lot of different use cases, and you can extend it not just 3 of 5. You can do 5 of 7 or 9 of 20. You can create your own multi-signature models based on whatever your use case is. Bisu is one we mentioned earlier. Just upgraded to their 1.4 client earlier this year. Bisu is an Ethereum client that runs on the Ethereum public network, but it also does private networks and test networks. And there's a few of the test networks, more popular test networks on Ethereum that are supported. Bisu includes several consensus algorithms, including proof of work, proof of authority, and IBTF, which is a Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus mechanism. Its comprehensive permissioning schemes are also designed specifically for uses in consortium environment. So, of course, we've seen many consortiums around many different industries being developed to deploy these networks and really drive the value of using these interoperable blockchain systems. So the fact that you can run Bisu on the public Ethereum network or in a private permission way gives this a lot of extensibility as far as the consortiums go. Being able to deploy these solutions first, maybe in a testing phase, and then in a more broader scope approach. So that was all the kind of core protocols, and they're adding to those all the time. But we also have to talk about the libraries that are being used, and these are code bases that are reusable across the different projects and are not restricted to Hyperledger only. One thing a lot of people seem to miss is the fact that all of these Hyperledger projects are open source, so you can add to them, you can fork them, reuse them in different ways. So these are very powerful tools that are contributing to the growth of this ecosystem. So some of the libraries that are mentioned here are the Hyperledger Aries, Transact, Ursa, and Quilt. Aries and Ursa are mainly used for the identity use cases in projects. These are infrastructure libraries that can be used for the toolkits for deploying those in the wallets that have to manage those, and the cryptographic frameworks that are working behind the scenes in that. Transact is a transaction execution platform designed to be used as a library or component when implementing distributed ledgers. And then Quilt is something, it's an entire interoperability solution for all the different blockchains and DLTs that are using Hyperledger based I think they're trying to extend that out to other things as well. But right now, that's what they're trying to do with that. I think that's fairly nascent in that library. And so with these libraries, suggested global forums that you can join and be a part of the growing community there. Kind of get ingratiated with what's happening, keep up the speed on the latest. Like I said, there's a lot of things happening. The space moves very, very quickly. Hyperledger is, of course, no exception to that. And then some of the tools that are being used as well. So you got Calibre, Cello, Explorer, and Avalon, which is their newest tool. You can explore what all these are. Or Explorer is just like a typical blockchain explorer. If you're familiar with public chains and how those work, that's what those are, usually to query any kind of transactions or status of nodes on the network. Calibre is a blockchain benchmark framework which allows users to measure the performance of a specific blockchain implementation with a set of predefined use cases. Cello is a deploy and manage and operate blockchains, supports various infrastructures like bare metal, VM platform, and container cloud support. These advanced operational analytics for the system status and ledger behavior. In Avalon, we mentioned earlier, which is a independent implementation of a trusted compute specifications published by the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So this is these are very exciting tools to use, or necessary tools. And some of these you're just going to need. They're the foundation of deploying a blockchain network. So domain-specific projects that have very specific focuses. Hyperledger Grid, which is a platform that's building supply chain solution that can include distributed ledger components and includes a set of libraries and data models and SDK to accelerate the development of a supply chain smart contracts and client interface. So this is specifically for cross-industry supply chain problems and solving those, and building those applications. And so, I'm conscious of time. We're a little bit over because we started a little bit later than we wanted to, but I hope this enabled you, give you an insight into the whole new world that Hyperledger is opening up as far as blockchain applications and tool sets and libraries that you can use and leverage. Again, they're open source. These networks are they're not owned or controlled by any particular company. Of course, the whole suite of Hyperledger is actually managed by the Linux Foundation, which is no stranger to open source protocol management. So it is in good hands, but definitely a lot to explore here, and this is again an emerging space, but it's emerging very rapidly in its application and its use. So stick around. We're going to be doing a Hyperledger meetup once a month. And we'll be diving, like I said, a little bit deeper into what each of these do, the different use cases that each platform is being deployed on, what's happening in the industry, and of course have guest speakers that can speak to this in a deeper level. So.
Yeah, and we would love to, whatever you all are interested in exploring or talking about or hearing in regards to Hyperledger, we're happy to take suggestions. You can put it in Meetup. Of course, we're on Meetup, or just email us, either Rosa at blockspaces.io or Gabe at blockspaces.io. And we would love to take that in any direction. You know, this world of enterprise blockchain, which we so embrace, right along with our cryptocurrency and you know, very public blockchain kind of soul. We love to see those worlds kind of collide. And you know, keeping in mind that this is Hyperledger. We have Corda, which we very much support and want to talk about as well. And in addition to that, you know, we have Quorum. So there's a range of enterprise blockchains, and we're interested in all of them.
Yeah, so stick around, get plugged into our ecosystem, into our community here. In order to do that, you can join us on our website or our Discord channel, which we can post the link in the notes. So join us there. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you soon.
Great, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, guys.